What if the most powerful dictator in literature never existed at all? Not because he was hiding. Not because nobody could find him. But because there may have been no one there in the first place. That sounds impossible. After all, when people think about absolute power in 1984, they think about one face. One name. One presence watching from every wall, every screen, every corner of society. Big Brother. But here's the paradox. The more visible Big Brother becomes, the harder it is to prove that he's actually real. And that's where the story stops being about a ruler. It becomes something far more unsettling. Because if millions of people obey a man who may not exist, then the source of power isn't the man. It's something else. Think about that for a moment. Most of us imagine tyranny as a pyramid. Someone sits at the top. Orders flow downward. Fear flows upward. Remove the person at the top, and the structure collapses. Simple. But what if that's not how power works at all? What if the strongest system is not one controlled by a leader, but one that no longer needs a leader? That's the question hiding beneath the surface of 1984. And it's a question that becomes more disturbing the longer you sit with it. Because throughout the world of Oceania, Big Brother is everywhere. His face appears constantly. His authority is unquestioned. His presence is treated as absolute reality. Yet certainty and evidence are not the same thing. In fact, one of the most fascinating contradictions in the novel is that the symbol grows stronger precisely because it becomes impossible to separate the symbol from the truth. The image remains. The belief remains. The fear remains. But the person? That's where the mystery begins. Imagine walking through a city covered with the same giant portrait. Every building. Every public square. Every screen. A face looking down from above. Now imagine nobody can tell you where that person is. Imagine nobody can prove they have ever met him. Imagine the entire structure of society depends on a figure who exists primarily as an idea. Suddenly the portrait becomes something different. Not a leader. A mechanism. A piece of psychological infrastructure. And that's where Big Brother transforms from a character into a symbol. Not a ruler who controls people directly. A symbol that teaches people to control themselves. Because the greatest achievement of any power system is not forcing obedience. It's making obedience feel automatic. Making surveillance unnecessary because people begin carrying the surveillance inside their own minds. That's why the mystery of Big Brother matters. Not because we want an answer to a literary puzzle. But because the answer changes the meaning of power itself. If Big Brother is real, then the system depends on a person. If Big Brother isn't real, then the system depends on something much larger. An idea. A belief. A fear powerful enough to survive without its creator. And once a society reaches that point, a disturbing possibility emerges. Maybe the face on the poster was never the most important part of the system. Maybe the real source of power was the invisible machine operating behind the face all along. And if that's true, then we've been asking the wrong question. The question is not, who is Big Brother? The question is, what kind of system becomes stronger when nobody knows whether its ruler even exists? But there is another problem hiding beneath this mystery. Even if Big Brother is only a symbol, symbols do not create obedience on their own. A poster cannot think. A portrait cannot enforce rules. An image hanging on a wall cannot reshape reality. So what is actually doing the work? This is where the conflict at the heart of 1984 becomes much deeper than a struggle between citizens and authority. The real conflict is between human consciousness and a system designed to occupy it. Notice something strange. The most important figure in the novel is not necessarily the most powerful actor. In many stories, power belongs to the character who makes decisions. The king. The president. The dictator. But in 1984, influence seems to flow differently. Big Brother functions less like a ruler and more like a gravitational center. People organize their thoughts around him. Institutions justify themselves through him. Loyalty is measured against him. Fear is attached to him. Yet the system never asks people to understand him. It only asks them to believe. That distinction matters. Because belief requires far less evidence than understanding. And once belief becomes the foundation of a society, a dangerous contradiction emerges. The less a symbol can be questioned, the more powerful it becomes. Think about the empty throne hidden inside the story. Not a literal chair, but an idea. A seat of authority that may not need an occupant. Most political systems depend on individuals. Leaders rise. Leaders fall. Presidents leave office. Kings die. Governments change. But symbols operate on a different timeline. A symbol can survive every person who ever served it. A symbol can outlive its creators. A symbol can become more real than reality itself. That possibility changes the entire meaning of power. Because if power depends on a person, then removing the person becomes a solution. But if power depends on a shared belief, then the challenge becomes infinitely more difficult. You are no longer confronting an individual. You are confronting a collective perception. And that is exactly where Winston's role becomes so important. Not as a traditional hero. Not as a revolutionary leader. But as a witness. A detector of contradictions. His significance comes from asking questions that the system cannot comfortably tolerate. Not because questions immediately threaten authority. But because questions reveal the hidden machinery behind authority. Every system built on unquestioned belief fears the same thing. Not rebellion. Investigation. Because investigation forces symbols to compete with reality. And reality is unpredictable. This creates another paradox. The society of Oceania appears obsessed with control. Yet beneath that obsession lies a profound insecurity. If the system were completely confident, why would it need constant reinforcement? Why would the image appear everywhere? Why would loyalty require endless repetition? Why would fear need constant maintenance? The answer may be that power is not as stable as it looks. The giant portrait staring down from every wall is not merely projecting strength. It may also be concealing weakness. And that changes how we interpret the entire structure. What appears permanent may actually be fragile. What appears confident may actually be afraid. What appears unified may be working desperately to prevent people from noticing a deeper truth. Because once people stop asking whether Big Brother exists, they begin asking a much more dangerous question. Who benefits from everyone believing that he does? Now the mystery shifts. The focus is no longer on the face watching society. The focus moves toward the machinery hidden behind the face. Toward the institutions, rituals, and narratives that continue operating regardless of who stands at the center. And that leads us to an even more unsettling possibility. What if the greatest illusion in 1984 is not the existence of Big Brother? What if the greatest illusion is the belief that power has a center at all? If power does not truly have a center, then another question immediately emerges. Why does the system work so hard to make it look as if it does? At first glance, that seems backwards. If authority is strongest when it is everywhere, why concentrate attention on a single face? Why place one image on every wall? Why build an entire emotional universe around a single figure? Because human beings struggle to fear abstractions. We fear people. We trust people. We blame people. A machine is difficult to love. A system is difficult to worship. An institution is difficult to imagine. A face solves that problem. And this is where one of the deepest contradictions inside the world of 1984 begins to reveal itself. The image of authority may exist not because power needs a ruler, but because people need a ruler-shaped story. That changes everything. Suddenly Big Brother appears less like the source of power and more like a protective mask placed over something much larger and much harder to understand. A civilization-sized mechanism. A structure that transforms belief into obedience and obedience into stability. And yet there is a hidden weakness inside that design. Every symbol creates two realities at the same time. The reality it presents, and the reality it conceals. The giant portrait watching over the city is a perfect memory fragment because it performs both functions simultaneously. It announces certainty while hiding complexity. It projects permanence while concealing constant maintenance. Because contrary to appearances, systems do not sustain themselves automatically. They require participation. They require repetition. They require millions of small acts of compliance performed day after day. That is why the deeper conflict is no longer between citizens and authority. It becomes a conflict between perception and participation. People often imagine oppressive systems as cages imposed from the outside. But many enduring systems operate differently. They move inward. They become habits, assumptions, reflexes, invisible boundaries that people eventually mistake for reality itself. This is where the role of O'Brien becomes particularly fascinating. Not as an enforcer, not merely as a representative of authority, but as an interpreter of reality. His influence comes from something more powerful than force. He represents a worldview in which truth itself becomes flexible. And once truth becomes negotiable, power acquires a completely new capability. It no longer needs to control actions first. It can begin by controlling meaning. That distinction carries enormous consequences. A society can survive disagreement about policies. It can survive disagreement about leaders. What it struggles to survive is disagreement about reality itself. When reality becomes unstable, people begin searching for certainty. And certainty is often where symbolic authority becomes strongest. Now the scale expands again. This is no longer simply a literary question. It becomes a civilizational question. Throughout history, institutions have repeatedly outlived their founders. Movements have survived the people who created them. Beliefs have continued shaping societies long after their original architects disappeared. The empty throne remains. The symbolic center remains. The machinery keeps moving. And that raises a disturbing possibility. Perhaps the most durable systems are not those built around loyalty to a person. Perhaps they are built around loyalty to a narrative. A narrative that explains the world. A narrative that defines enemies. A narrative that tells people what is true. Because once a narrative reaches that level of influence, removing individuals changes remarkably little. The structure adapts. The symbols evolve. The story continues. And suddenly the mystery surrounding Big Brother begins to look different. Maybe the important question is not whether he exists. Maybe the important question is whether his existence was ever necessary. Because if the face is only a mask, then someone must have designed the mask. And if someone designed the mask, then there may be another layer hidden beneath everything we have discussed so far. Not the ruler. Not the symbol. Not even the institution. But the architects who understood that the most effective form of control is convincing people that control is simply the natural order of the world. And once that possibility enters the conversation, a far more dangerous mystery appears. If Big Brother is not the true center of power, then who benefits from everyone looking at him instead of looking behind him? If the system does not revolve around a single center of power, then something far more precise must be holding it together. Not a person. Not even a symbol. But a mechanism that decides what people are allowed to perceive as real. This is the moment where the structure of 1984 shifts from political mystery into cognitive architecture. Revelation begins here. The most important function of Big Brother is not to exist or not exist. His function is to stabilize uncertainty. To give ambiguity a face. To convert invisible control into something emotionally legible. Because human psychology cannot endure pure abstraction for long. It needs anchors. It needs focal points. It needs something to aim fear at, even if that target is only partially real. This is why the memory fragment of the ever-present face becomes essential. A face that appears everywhere is not merely surveillance. It is orientation. It tells the mind where to place its attention when reality becomes too complex to hold. But the deeper revelation is this. The system does not rely on people believing in Big Brother. It relies on people never thinking beyond him. That distinction changes the entire architecture of power. A visible ruler can be questioned. A known enemy can be resisted. A confirmed presence can be disproven. But a conceptual boundary cannot be fought in the same way. It simply defines the limits of thought. And within those limits, everything feels natural. Consider the memory fragment of the empty throne. It is not just a symbol of absence. It is a structural feature. The absence itself becomes productive. It removes the need for verification. It removes the need for evidence. It removes the need for certainty. And what replaces it is something more efficient than truth. Plausibility. At this point, the role of O'Brien transforms in meaning. He is not merely a figure of authority or interpretation. His influence represents the system's ability to convert contradiction into coherence. To make opposing ideas feel like they belong to the same structure of logic. He does not simply enforce belief. He reorganizes perception. That is the real breakthrough. Because once perception is reorganized, resistance becomes cognitively expensive. Not impossible. Just increasingly unstable. Now the consequence expands beyond individuals. This is no longer about obedience inside Oceania. It becomes about how entire societies learn to accept frameworks they cannot fully verify, simply because those frameworks are shared, repeated, and reinforced. The memory fragment of the telescreen is critical here. It is not just surveillance. It is a feedback loop. It does not only observe behavior. It shapes the conditions under which behavior is considered normal. And that introduces a second layer revelation. Control does not require omnipresence. It only requires consistency. Consistency creates expectation. Expectation creates compliance. Compliance becomes identity. At this scale shift, Big Brother stops being relevant as a question of existence. The more important structure is what happens when identity itself becomes dependent on external validation. A society begins to stabilize around what it expects to be true, not what can be proven to be true. And once that happens, authority no longer needs to assert itself aggressively. It only needs to maintain coherence. This is why the image remains even when its source becomes irrelevant. The image is not pointing upward to a ruler. It is pointing inward to a shared cognitive agreement. Now the system reveals its deepest function. It is not primarily designed to punish deviation. It is designed to make deviation feel like confusion. And confusion is a powerful form of containment. Because a confused mind does not resist. It recalibrates. It tries to re-enter coherence. And in doing so, it returns to the system without force being applied. At this point, the central mystery begins to invert. Instead of asking who controls the system, the question becomes whether control requires a controller at all. And if it does not, then the idea of leadership itself becomes secondary to something more fundamental. The architecture of belief. But even this is not the final layer. Because if belief can organize power without a center, then something else must be sustaining belief itself. Something distributed. Something repeated. Something that survives even when every visible structure changes. And that leads to a final unsettling revelation forming at the edge of understanding. What if Big Brother is not the origin of power at all? What if he is the final shape that power takes when it no longer needs to reveal where it came from? If the system no longer depends on a central ruler, then what exactly is the force that keeps every part aligned without collapse? The answer is not another hidden leader. It is something far more unsettling, because it does not exist in one place. It exists in repetition. The core revelation is this: power in this world is not maintained by authority figures, but by the continuous reproduction of belief until belief becomes indistinguishable from reality itself. At that point, control is no longer an action. It becomes a condition of perception. This is the deepest layer of the system inside 1984. Not surveillance. Not propaganda. Not even fear. But synchronization of thought across millions of minds until alternative interpretations of reality simply stop forming. That is why the memory fragment of the constant face matters so much. It is not just an image of authority. It is a cognitive anchor that stabilizes interpretation. Every time uncertainty appears, the mind returns to a preloaded structure of meaning. The system does not force a conclusion. It limits the available conclusions until only one feels natural. And that is the true architecture of control. Not domination. Convergence. This is where Winston Smith's role becomes critical. He is not a revolutionary in the traditional sense. His influence exists in the disruption of convergence. His mind produces fractures in what is supposed to feel seamless. He does not destroy the system physically. He interrupts its ability to remain cognitively invisible. But the contradiction is severe. Because the system does not respond to disruption by collapsing. It responds by absorbing disruption and redefining it as part of coherence. This is where O'Brien's function reaches its highest form. He is not enforcing truth. He is demonstrating that truth is a flexible output of the system itself. In his presence, contradiction does not break reality. It is reprocessed into structure. What should cause collapse becomes reinforcement. That is the real revelation. The system is not fragile because it is false. It is stable because it can integrate falseness without losing coherence. Memory fragment, the telescreen remains active not because it sees everything, but because it ensures that everything seen is already interpreted through a shared framework. Memory fragment, the face on the wall does not confirm a leader. It confirms that interpretation itself has been centralized. At this level, Big Brother is no longer even necessary as an entity. He functions as a residual output of a deeper mechanism that organizes perception before thought can fully form. And once perception is organized at that speed, resistance becomes structurally delayed. Not blocked. Not erased. Simply rendered out of sync with reality as it is experienced. This is why the system does not fear truth in the traditional sense. It fears unsynchronized cognition. A mind that begins to interpret outside the shared structure does not just disagree. It becomes temporally misaligned with its environment. And that is more destabilizing than rebellion. Because rebellion assumes a shared reference point. But unsynchronized thought does not. Now the scale shifts beyond individuals and institutions. This is no longer about Oceania. It becomes a model for any system where reality is not discovered, but distributed. A world where meaning is not found, but assigned through repetition. And once that realization emerges, the entire structure of authority transforms again. Because the ultimate function of such a system is not to enforce obedience. It is to eliminate the possibility of imagining alternatives that feel real enough to pursue. That is the deepest consequence. Not control of action. Control of imagination. And if imagination itself is shaped by repetition, then the boundary between belief and truth collapses completely. At that point, Big Brother is neither real nor unreal. He is the final stabilization point of a system that has successfully replaced external reality with internally reinforced consensus. The philosophical consequence is unavoidable. If a society can reach a state where shared belief becomes more structurally stable than objective reality, then what does it even mean to say that truth exists outside of perception? And if truth cannot exist independently of perception at scale, then the question is no longer who controls reality. The question becomes whether reality is something that can still be considered separate from the systems that describe it at all. At this stage, the system no longer feels like something that was built. It feels like something that emerged, layer by layer, through repetition until no one could clearly remember when it began. And that is where the consequence becomes irreversible. Once a structure of belief reaches the point where it no longer depends on a visible origin, it stops behaving like a creation and starts behaving like a condition of reality itself. This is the silent aftermath of everything previously revealed. Not collapse. Not victory. But permanence through absorption. Every attempt to isolate the source of authority leads back into the same structure that is supposed to be explained. Every question about control is processed into a form that strengthens coherence rather than weakening it. The system does not resist interpretation. It absorbs interpretation until interpretation loses its edge. That is the true consequence of a world where perception has been synchronized. Memory fragment, the ever-present face, does not simply represent power. It represents the exhaustion of alternative explanations. A mind exposed to the same signal long enough stops generating competing narratives. Not because it is forced to, but because divergence becomes cognitively expensive. This is the long-term psychological effect. Not fear as a reaction, but fear as a baseline. Not obedience as a decision, but obedience as default interpretation. And in that shift, individuality does not disappear. It becomes less relevant than alignment. Winston Smith's role, in this final structural phase, is no longer just disruption. It becomes historical residue. A trace of what it means for a mind to resist a system that has already adapted to resistance as part of its design space. His influence does not collapse the structure. It reveals how little the structure depends on any single point of failure. That is the legacy of O'Brien's function as well. Not as a character enforcing ideology, but as an interface between contradiction and coherence. His presence demonstrates that even opposing thoughts can be processed without destabilizing the system. Conflict becomes input. Dissent becomes material. Nothing escapes transformation into stability. Memory fragment, the telescreen does not only watch. It confirms that what is seen is already understood in advance by the system that defines meaning itself. At this level, Big Brother is no longer even required as a conceptual anchor. The system continues to operate as if the anchor exists, but its absence would not change functionality. That is the deepest consequence of symbolic power. Once a symbol successfully organizes perception, it no longer needs verification to remain effective. This creates a scale shift that extends beyond the fictional world. Because the same structure can appear wherever shared belief becomes more stable than external verification. Institutions, narratives, and digital environments can all reach this state where repetition replaces origin and coherence replaces proof. The legacy is not a single regime or a single ideology. The legacy is a method of stabilizing reality through alignment of perception. And once that method exists, it becomes transferable. It does not belong to one world. It becomes a pattern that can emerge anywhere cognition is shaped by synchronized repetition. That is why the true aftermath of this structure is not historical. It is philosophical. If reality is experienced through systems that continuously reinforce what can be perceived, then the boundary between constructed meaning and independent truth becomes increasingly difficult to locate. And if that boundary cannot be clearly defined, then the consequences extend beyond politics or control. They reach into the foundation of how awareness organizes itself in the first place. Which leads to a final unresolved tension. If a system can remain stable even when its origin is no longer identifiable, and if perception can be aligned without a central source of authority, then what exactly is the role of origin in maintaining reality at all? In the end, the most unsettling realization is not that power hides itself, but that it no longer needs to. It does not retreat into secrecy. It does not rely on a single figure. It does not even require a stable center to remain effective. It continues because the conditions that sustain it have been internalized. And once something is internalized at scale, it stops feeling like an external force and starts feeling like reality itself. This is the final insight left behind by everything that has unfolded. The system does not dominate by standing above people. It stabilizes itself by existing inside the way people interpret the world. Meaning becomes the medium through which structure survives. And repetition becomes the mechanism through which meaning remains intact. Memory fragment, a face repeated across every surface eventually stops being seen as an image and starts functioning as a reference point for reality itself. But what lingers most is not the image. It is the absence of an alternative. That absence is the real inheritance. Winston Smith's significance, when viewed from this final distance, is not that he resisted or failed. It is that he revealed how fragile the boundary is between questioning reality and being absorbed back into it. His role was never to defeat a system, but to expose how deeply systems depend on the limits of what can be imagined. Memory fragment, the ever-present telescreen, does not merely observe behavior, it ensures that interpretation returns to a shared baseline before deviation can fully form. O'Brien's function, in retrospect, becomes even more precise. Not as a symbol of authority, but as proof that contradiction itself can be processed without collapse. In such a structure, even opposition becomes part of continuity. Nothing escapes integration. Nothing remains outside the system long enough to define itself independently. And Big Brother, when stripped of every layer of interpretation, no longer appears as a person, a myth, or even a symbol with fixed meaning. He becomes something quieter than all of those. A stabilizing idea that persists only because it continues to be useful as a shared point of reference. Memory fragment, the constant gaze from the wall, is less about who is watching, and more about ensuring that everyone agrees they are being watched in the same way. At this distance, the entire structure reveals its final shape. Not a hierarchy. Not a dictatorship in the traditional sense. But a closed loop of perception, where reality is continuously reinforced by the act of recognizing it in the same form. The legacy of this structure is not confined to its world. It extends into any system where shared understanding becomes more powerful than independent verification. Where repetition replaces discovery. Where alignment becomes more important than accuracy. And yet, the most human part of this entire architecture remains unresolved. Because even within a system designed to stabilize perception, the act of questioning still emerges. Not as rebellion. Not as strategy. But as a natural instability within consciousness itself. That is the final echo left behind. The awareness that sees structure and still asks what lies beyond it. And perhaps the most difficult question is not whether such systems exist. It is whether human thought, by its very nature, will always generate the possibility of stepping outside them. If every structure of meaning eventually becomes self-sustaining, and every self-sustaining structure eventually shapes how reality is perceived, then what remains truly independent enough to recognize the structure at all?